Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to come back to the University of Dallas. I have been here before, but I can't come back this time and talk to you about Machiavelli without giving a salute to my friend and really twin at this university, Leopold de Alvarez. We've been working together on Machiavelli over the years for pretty much all of our careers, and we've come not to identical but to fairly similar results. And I want to say hello to him. So, Machiavelli's Verità Effetuale. What I'm going to do in this talk is to take this phrase, and this phrase comes in the first paragraph of the 15th chapter of the Prince. And this whole talk is going to be on that paragraph, and especially this phrase in that paragraph. 500 years ago, it's now a little bit longer, December 10th, 1513, Machiavelli wrote a letter to a friend of his in Rome, describing one day in his life as an exile from Florence, and remarking casually that he'd just completing writing The Prince. This momentous book, together with its companion, the Discourses on Livy, neither of them published until after his death. In 1527, they were published 5 years later, announces an enterprise affecting all human beings today, the creation of the modern world. Machiavelli is famous for his infamy, for being Machiavellian, but his importance is almost universally underestimated. The extent of his consequences is not appreciated, and the size of his ambition is little known. He makes it possible, even easy, to suppose that his ambition is confined to place hunting with Lorenzo de' Medici and service as drill master of the Florentine Republic, as if his thought was bounded by his employment opportunities, and he had nothing in mind in the way of self-employment. Of course, everyone senses his greatness as a writer, a master of Italian prose with a gift for an acute phrase, often worth citing for effect, but almost never actually avowed for use. I am a Machiavellian is not something one usually hears. In addition to his maxims, which in truth are deliberately exaggerated, he does not receive much respect as a guide to the future. But a guide with foresight is just what Machiavelli is, if one adds that he made the future to which he guides us. To see how important Machiavelli was, one must first look to see how important he meant to be. His own words are quite expansive. In the dedicatory letter to his Florentine histories, he refers to my enterprise, la mia impresa, without saying what it was. But in the preface to the first book of the Discourses on Livy, he avows a grand purpose that encompasses his whole life. He has a, quote, natural desire to work for those things I believe will bring common benefit to everyone, or to each, a ciascuno. A natural desire is in human nature, not just in the humans of Machiavelli's time. And the beneficiaries will be everyone, all humanity, not just his native country or city. He goes on to say that he has, quote, decided to take a path as yet untrodden by anyone. He will benefit everyone by taking a new path. He is not just imitating the ancients or contributing to the Renaissance, the rebirth of the ancients. Obviously, his new path leads back to the ancients, but it does not end there. In the middle of The Prince, that's this paragraph I'm talking about, he declares, I depart from the orders of others, also emphasizing his originality. One soon learns that the others include both the Renaissance and the ancients that he refers to repeatedly. Machiavelli departs from the tradition of thought beginning with the Greek or Socratic philosophy that was still powerful in his time in the form of scholasticism, and the humanism that revolted against scholasticism. He surely belonged to the broad Socratic tradition in some sense, but he also mainly departed from it. And he departs from the Bible while appropriating it to his use. He cannot be interpreted as captured by any tradition or context. Or if he was a prisoner who tried to escape, not a passive prisoner. I shall set forth the idea that Machiavelli, with his enterprise, was not caused by his context, but was the cause of a context, our context. To create the modern world, Machiavelli initiated a twofold transformation of politics and philosophy that would bring them together. Politics with the elevation of philosophy, and philosophy brought down to earth. These two motions come together in the Prince, now understood not merely as a ruler, but also as a thinker, devoted to improving the prospects of princes, and incidentally or not incidentally, their peoples, so that princes become knowers of the world in quotes, il mondo. It was necessary for Machiavelli to reverse the meaning of modern and to create a new meaning of world. Modern would no longer signify the weakness taught by Christianity, but would acquire new vigor from obeying human necessities rather than divine commands. The world would be this world as opposed to the next world of Christianity and to the high-minded morality of classical philosophy. The new meaning of world is the context Machiavelli has made for us. One may start, for the transformation of politics, one may start from a few of his best one-line formulations. Quote, "In truth, there is no secure method to possess a free cities other than to ruin them." Quote, "Spending what is someone else's does not take a reputation from you, but adds it to you." Quote, "A prudent lord cannot observe faith, nor should he when such observance turns against him." Quote, "It is much safer to be feared than loved." These and other such expressions of calculated evil are summed up in the statement of revolt from the orders of others, quoted above, that it is, quote, "necessary to a prince, if he wants to maintain himself, to learn to be able not to be good, and to use this and not use it according to necessity." Notice two necessaries in one sentence. It is necessary to learn how to act according to necessity. To reach this conclusion, Machiavelli opposes the many who rely on, quote, imagined republics and principalities that have never been known to exist in truth. Such writers make a, quote, profession of good in all regards, on which those who do not write or read but merely live by moral principle implicitly rely for support. Machiavelli does not cite names, but one thinks of Plato's Republic for an imagined republic or monarchy. Aristotle's imagined monarchy of the good man. And if God is a prince, the city of God of St. Augustine. Each of these writers works out what it would mean to be good in all regards for an individual, and since men do not live as isolated individuals, for a society as well. The working out has to be imagined, because a society that is good in all regards, quote, has never been seen or known to exist in truth. Truth means the effectual truth, as opposed to what is merely imagined when people profess they are good and philosophers imagine their profession of good in its full extent. The effectual truth of morality comes down to its political effects, when the lofty professions are applied among those who are not good. Machiavelli concentrates the power of this phrase, the effectual truth, Verità Effetuale, by using it just this once in all his writings. just once, this key phrase. Indeed, Machiavelli scholars have been unable to find any other use of the phrase in the Italian Renaissance among humanist authors, and I'm not aware of any earlier use of it. Apparently, Machiavelli invented the word effettuale, effectual. Its power was intended by Machiavelli to reach his successors, captains in the army of his enterprise, for them to develop. And so it was. He was the pioneer for Bacon, Descartes, and the other founders of modern philosophy who set conditions for knowledge of the world whose necessity he discovered, Machiavelli discovered, whose possibility he created. He showed the path for them to follow in a single paragraph in The Prince. One could almost say in the flick of this unrepeated single phrase. We may begin an attempt to understand the phrase that Machiavelli first formulated by contrasting it to the two main alternative notions that he faced of truth made effective. In the Bible, the truth of revelation is to be brought to all by God's ministers. As Paul said, quote, according to the grace of God given unto me by the effectual working of his power. Effectual working, the Greek is energeia, that Aristotelian word. And effectual working is the King James Version. So this comes after Machiavelli's phrase, which was a century earlier. Marsilius of Padua, an author known to Machiavelli, quoting Aristotle, speaks of false belief as a hindrance to truth, an obstacle to its becoming effectual. In neither case, that is, Paul or Marsilius, is the truth itself effectual. Rather, it is that divine or human aid can make it effectual or not. But effectual truth is truth that can make itself effectual without the aid of outside force. It is truth with its own power to create effects, and thus impress itself on those who would otherwise resist truth. This impressive truth is new truth that lacks the advantage of having tradition on its side, but that has a power that can overcome the customary resistance to truth of which Machiavelli is acutely aware. New truth is more powerful than settled truth, not despite its newness, but because of it. It gains power from its very opposition to whatever is established and inherited. Coming out of the practices and devices of scheming evil, effectual truth signifies the closing of the gap between politics and philosophy, in the entrance of Machiavelli himself, the philosopher, as the prince. Is Machiavelli a philosopher? He does not say that he is. He uses the word very sparingly and does not openly address those he calls philosophers. He himself reports and seems to approve of Cato's rejection of philosophy. Cato, the Roman, warns the Romans, of his republic, of the dangers that would come to the republic and its moral virtue from the introduction of Greek philosophy. He seems to approve of that, Machiavelli does, for the evil of, quote, honorable idleness by which it infects and corrupts the virtue of Rome. Honorable idleness, ozio onorevole, or ozio ambizioso. Those are the two Italian phrases, wonderful phrases that Machiavelli uses to describe the intellectual climate of his time. It's an ambitious leisure, or that's a lot of ambitious people with nothing for ambition to gain. And onorevole idleness, the honorable idleness with no honors to acquire. Machiavelli seems to confide himself. He rarely speaks of the philosopher, just once in The Prince and 3 times in the Discourses. He seems to confine himself to politics, to the means and conditions for political success. Yet, he indicates that he is a philosopher, and repeatedly, insistently, in several ways. If his focus is on politics, it is politics understood expansively as the world and worldly things, cose del mondo. To expand politics to include the world implies that the world governs politics, or politics governs the world, or both. In his day, the notion of the world immediately raised the question of which world? This one or the next? Here we find ourselves immediately engaged in the question that defines philosophy and distinguishes it from revealed religion. The question between philosophy and religion can be put in political terms as a dispute over which world governs the other, and whether politics can manage or God must provide for human fortunes. Fortuna, or fortune, being, as everyone knows, a prominent theme of Machiavelli's. Machiavelli sets forth the dispute in two separate places that the reader must make the effort to put together. Incidentally, as it seems, to justify not omitting something, he says in a clause in the Discourses, quote, "Since it is good to reason about everything." Whereas in the Prince, he says again in a clause, "Although one should not reason about Moses, as he was a mere executor of things that had been ordered for him by God." He does not expressly argue for and against the question whether faith sets limits to reason, as a philosopher who wanted to make himself obvious might do, but leaves a contradiction that is blatant when exposed. Now, why should one not reason about Moses? Moses is a figure in the Bible, the book of God, that commands reverence and is revered. To reason about Moses is to question the reverence in which he is held, and to challenge the belief that holds him in reverence. To reason about everything is the work of a philosopher, who as such challenges belief merely by asking questions. To believe is to hold the answers the philosopher questions. Thus we have a distinction between the philosopher who questions and the believer or non-philosopher who has answers he does not question. This does not mean that no one who reasons should believe, or that the philosopher has no beliefs. Machiavelli himself has beliefs and frequently says he believes something, but his beliefs arise from his reasoning and serve it. It is good, he says, to reason about everything, and also good not to reason about everything, about Moses. The latter must mean that it is good, having reasoned or while reasoning about everything, not to appear to reason about everything. Machiavelli does not call himself a philosopher or say that he's bringing a new mode of philosophy, but leaves these things to be inferred from hints or allusions or incomplete solitary statements surrounded with innocent, apparently non-philosophic context. In the famous letter that I mentioned at the beginning, he left a memorable picture of the life of a philosopher and of himself as a philosopher, in which he suffers the malignity of his fate. He is one who, after noisy, contentious card-playing in the inn that he frequents, he sits down in the evening with his books to the conversation of his mind within itself, in the quiet of his study, to which he repairs for 4 hours in the evening, during which he forgets every pain and fears neither poverty nor death. He imagines himself clothed in regal and courtly garments, so as to, quote, enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them lovingly, I feed on the food that alone is mine, and that I was born for. Apparently equal to the occasion, he says he is, quote, not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reason for their actions. And they, in their humanity, reply to me. It is hard not to recognize the contrast as the one dear to the ancients with whom he converses between the philosophical and the non-philosophical life. It is a natural difference, one Machiavelli is born for, from which his rowdy company, as he called it, of the day, whom he does not hesitate to call vermin, is excluded. Yet, despite this beautiful description of philosophizing, he still does not call himself philosopher. Nor does Machiavelli call himself prince. He advises princes, an actual prince in the Prince, and potential princes in the Discourses. But in advising them, he orders them around and speaks like a prince. As in, quote, I depart from the orders of others, in the critical paragraph we are studying. In the Prince, he moves from homage or servitude to Lorenzo de' Medici at the beginning, to telling him, quote, that one should not let this opportunity pass at the end. In a chapter of the Discourses devoted to the ordering of Rome, he switches from analyzing Rome to someone, quote, who might wish, quote, to order a republic anew, someone who might be himself. In our paragraph, he considers morality from the standpoint of a prince, to explain why it is necessary to do evil. Out of his princely critique of morality, he moves quickly to truth, or what is today called epistemology. By following closely what he says in this small space, we shall see how Machiavelli's politics is elevated to truth, and his philosophy lowered to what is visible in the world. Now, why is a profession of good in all regards supposed necessary to morality? Those who do good rely on others not to take advantage of them, indeed to return that good in gratitude, so that do-gooders will not, quote, come to ruin. The many who do not write or read, but merely live by moral principle, implicitly rely on the argument of philosophy or religion to show convincingly that they can afford to be moral. Good deeds must be accompanied with an explanation, quote, a profession of good. And because a deed that appears good may be done with evil intent, the doer needs to profess the good he does as well as perform it. But also because evil may appear good, no visible evidence will suffice to prove the intent of the doer, and his profession must appeal to some invisible principle or realm. It must rely on imagination to guarantee its existence. In sum, as Machiavelli sees it, the foundation for morality, what makes it reliable, what justifies taking the risk of coming to ruin by doing a moral deed, is a profession, quote unquote. That is, a pretense of philosophy or religion. A profession of good in all regards would have to be the good society as a whole, not merely isolated good actions taken by themselves. So Machiavelli says that many rely on, quote, imagined republics and principalities that have never been known to exist in truth. He was not content with returning to the ancients, for they had been the remote cause of the corruption he saw in his time. They had opened the possibility of an imaginary regime that would not merely offer a goal to actual earthly regimes, but would rival and even attempt to displace those regimes. The imaginary republic of Plato's city in speech had become the imaginary principality, imagined to be actual, of St. Augustine's city of God. Imaginary republics and principalities in these professions had been replaced by the God who could make them come to pass in this world and in the next. This meant that the cosmos, Plato's intelligible realm of the ideas, which was intended to make sense of the visible world, was now represented by the next world, also invisible, of Christian revelation, presiding over this world, still the world of the senses. In both cases, the invisible was used to explain the visible. to make up what it lacked in intelligibility and perfection. Machiavelli's outlook from the standpoint of effectual truth was the reverse. It explained the human aspiration to perfection, which is to the invisible, by the visible effects it produced in this world. He undertook to present and defend this world so that we would esteem more than Christianity does, quote, the honor of the world. He could not present the world without defending it against the imaginary worlds. His reduction of the imaginary requires an inflation and vindication of the visible, the non-imaginary. His notion of the effectual truth is an anticipation of, or foundation for, the scientific reductionism that was to follow him. Both reductions share the promise of the benefits to be gained from exposing the imposture of our imaginations by which we try to transcend the visible world. To make his point, Machiavelli does not refer in either the Prince or the Discourses to the next or other world, thus not to the distinction between this world and the next. But he does speak frequently, if never at length, of the world in his two main books, leaving to his readers, as always, the task of reasoning out to a suitable length the connections among his references and their sum. It appears first that the world is a whole. We find 3 references to the whole world in his two main works. Neither Plato nor the Christians would have admitted that the visible world by itself constitutes a whole. For because of its imperfections, it has to be supplemented by supramundane or superhuman intelligence and power. By speaking of characteristics of the world, Machiavelli presumes it can be known. But he also speaks of knowing the world. He criticizes the Florentines, the Venetians, and a pope for not knowing the world. Above all, he claims for himself that in the Discourses he has expressed, quote, as much as I know and have learned through a long practice and continual reading in worldly things. Both practice and reading are required. The school of hard knocks is needed. But that might not teach you that this world, where hard knocks abound, is the world. Indeed, once you know this world is the only world, you can infer what practice in necessities, i.e. hard knocks, will tell you. Quote, worldly things have, quote, a limit to their life, and are variable. Deceit is an aspect of the world. In the actions of the world, men ordinarily understand little, especially not what is extraordinary. Yet, quote, in the world there is no one but the vulgar, showing that the truth must eventually come out so as to be appreciated by ordinary people, though what they appreciate as true may not be true. In Machiavelli's Effectual Truth, the truth is not forever hidden, but it is shown in its effects. The truth of the world is not shown in the articulation of nature into parts that are intelligible as parts, the parts of a whole, like the branches of a tree. That unintelligibility is the meaning of the unspecific worldly things that Machiavelli says he studied. Although Machiavelli speaks frequently of nature and natural, he does not give them definitions, except in a provisional way. In the only chapter of the two works whose heading mentions nature, the same nature that's his phrase, the same nature he refers to, proves in the body of the chapter to mean, quote, the same customs for a long time. The prince he calls natural in the Prince, second chapter of the Prince, is nothing but an hereditary prince. When commenting on the difference between a cautious and an impetuous nature, he suggests the possibility of changing one's nature according to the times. After distinguishing in the Prince between the nature of princes and the nature of peoples, saying that to know the prince one must be of the people, and vice versa, he proceeds to discuss them both as if the distinction did not apply to himself. Believe it or not, the whole world, quote, can be excited by indignation, and it can be consumed by love and hate. It can be or can conspire against France. It can be characterized as a whole by weakness because of Christianity, or corruption because of French, Spanish, and Italian customs. Yet it can be, quote, full of peace, and offer, quote, the glory of the world. Under the good Roman emperors between Nerva and Marcus, when, quote, the world was full of peace and justice, one saw, quote, the world in triumph, the prince full of reverence and glory, the peoples full of love and security. These were golden times when, quote, each can hold and defend the opinion he wishes. Sounds like a paradise for John Stuart Mill, with freedom for philosophers and glory and security for princes and peoples. These emperors include, quote, the philosopher Marcus. That's the only time he speaks of philosopher in the Prince. But the philosopher emperor is not mentioned, is not presented in Mill's paradise. No. He is plucked out of the, quote, triumph of the world and paired with the emperor Severus, who was called a criminal in the Discourses, to provide a model for a prince. Severus for founding it, and Marcus for maintaining it. For Machiavelli, quote, the world centers on the necessity to do evil, but it seems not to be bereft of morality, as one might suppose from the adjective Machiavellian. He wishes to maintain a certain worldly morality of a new kind, in which the philosopher, namely Machiavelli, has a new role. Instead of soothing moral anger and opposing moral contradiction, the philosopher makes friends both with criminality and with moral indignation against criminality. To preserve either a republic or a principality, one must take it back to its beginning. And this means that an appeal to patriotism or to its hereditary line will not suffice. One must revive the original fear that precedes and is the basis for any later patriotism or fealty. Machiavelli was a patriot, to be sure, though for Florence or for Italy. Big question for him. And of course he says in a letter that he loved his patria more than his own soul. But as a philosopher he might have said, though he did not volunteer it, that he loves his insight more than his patria, and that his undertaking is grander than his defense of a patria, unless his patria is something even grander than Florence and Italy, as I think it is. His patria is the world, of which he is a knower, sometimes presented as the earth, sometimes as, quote, Italy, unquote. The universal beginning is a first principle, but with a home, and the home is defined against what is foreign. The world has its necessities, not in intelligible definitions or essences, but in patterns of behavior. Princes and peoples, for example, are in a rather strange relationship. Those few who wish to command in relation to those many who do not wish to be commanded. Here's the classical political division between the few and the many, to be found in Plato and Aristotle. But Machiavelli sees it differently. The few and the many are not presented in a manner to bring them together in a whole of quality and quantity, the few representing quality and the many quantity, as in Aristotle's Politics. Instead, princes and peoples are set at odds, the former insisting on what the latter insist must not be. Princes want to command, peoples don't want to be commanded. Each humor has its necessity, but the two necessities are contrary to each other. And the result is not a harmonious whole, but a world in which the necessary humors of princes can be accomplished only by deceiving or manipulating the necessary humor of peoples. The one necessity, desiring to command, includes the denial of that necessity by the other necessity, desiring not to be commanded. And princes, if they are to know the world, must understand that peoples as such do not understand the world. Princes must see the necessity of deceit. Here we have in sharp focus the kind of analysis of necessities that our social science, unconsciously imitating Machiavelli but very far from matching his acuity, retails with jargon and false precision. The deceit of the princes is expressed in what Machiavelli, borrowing from the Averroists, calls the sect. All sects obey the necessity of human nature that require the people to be reassured that they do not live under the necessity of being commanded, but that their being ruled is justified, and justice is possible. Yet some sects are more in keeping with human necessities than others. In the Christian sect under which Machiavelli lived, and he had the impudence to speak of the Christian sect, with its provisions for the interference of the next world in the honor of this world, overlooked the necessity of the human desire to command, of human ambition. Hence, justice is not possible. But it is necessary to the people to believe that it is. Necessities are not necessarily recognized. In fact, they necessarily will not be recognized by peoples as opposed to princes. Knowledge of the world's necessities includes the necessary ignorance of most human beings regarding those necessities. To reform contemplative philosophy, Machiavelli moved to assert the necessities of the world against the intelligibility of the heavenly cosmos and the supra-heavenly whole. His nature, as opposed to that of Plato and Aristotle, lacked the lasting or eternal intelligibles of nature, as they conceived it. To assert the claim of nature against theology, Machiavelli changes nature to the world, or more precisely, because the world is not an intelligible whole, to worldly things. To understand the world, you have to poke your nose into worldly things and stay there. The world, according to Machiavelli, is the world of sense. In replacing the whole of intelligible nature with the world of sense, he discovered the world of fact underneath the reason of things. In doing so, he laid the foundation for modern philosophy, which is modern epistemology, as it came to be called, and its two modes, modern empiricism and modern rationalism. Machiavelli's effectual truth of the thing means that to understand a thing, you must look at it politically, which means looking at it, quote, in all regards of human life as a whole. Politics is the human whole, and the human whole is all there is. What is politically effectual in a thing consists both of the effects it produces and the effects it displays, both what it causes and how it is seen. So Machiavelli substitutes the world with its necessities for two rival but related notions. The first is the other world of Christianity, and the second is the cosmos of classical rationalism with its intelligible and intelligent beings. Both notions set the highest virtue in contemplation and hover over this world to criticize it from their very different standpoints: the godliness of Christianity and the nobility of Socratic philosophy. Machiavelli believed that they were related in their high-mindedness, the Christian God being the effectual truth of the good, or the idea of the good. For men in their thumos want to personify the good in a being that would guarantee its possession for them. They would want a providence to take care of them, turning a common noun, the good, into a proper noun, God. Therefore, to defend this world, Machiavelli decided that he would have to go beyond the equivocal compromises with Christianity made by the humanists. And he had to attack Christianity directly and openly, rather than combine it and thus compare it with classical rationalism as they did. He would have to, quote, depart from the orders of others and leave the ancients behind, much as he loved them. For the sake of philosophy and each one of humanity, he would alter the character of philosophy as well as the sort of humanity it recommends. No longer are we to imitate Socrates and Jesus. Our models now are Severus and Cesare Borgia, installing the new primacy of evil. Evil is, of course, somehow good, but good folk, if they want to be reasonable, have to admit this. One other phrase from our single paragraph in The Prince needs to be examined. Machiavelli says that it appears to him more fitting, quote, to go directly, andare diretto, to the effectual truth, bypassing the profession of good. To look at the effect or the outcome of an event means to consider it in the light of the necessity, that is, the various necessities of its participants, and thereby to ignore their opposing intentions regarding its goodness. Goodness is complicated, which is why it requires a, quote, profession of good in all regards. Necessity simplifies by going directly to the effect without regard to opposing claims and doubtful or contradictory reasonings. Machiavelli recommends acting first and reasoning, or as we now say, rationalizing, afterwards. For, quote, to many things that reason does not bring you, necessity brings you. An example of what he wants to avoid can be seen at the Palazzo Pubblico of Siena, a city rival to Florence, which perhaps some of you have visited. In Siena, in this Palazzo Pubblico, the public, it's a city hall, there's a room called the Sala della Pace, the Room of Peace, and its famous frescoes of good and bad government done by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in 1338 to 1340. So this is before Machiavelli's time. Frescoes are paintings which are done not on canvas but directly into a wall. And in this Sala della Pace, these frescoes show the effects, are called that. They use that word, effetti, it's in Italian, right up on the wall. The effects of good government on one wall, and the effects of bad government on the opposing wall. The virtues of one and the vices of the other. Now these effects, different effects, imply the possibility of choice between virtue and vice. And they are connected by a wall. So there's, like, these are three walls, one with the effects, and then another wall that connects them. Which amounts to a depiction of the sort of profession of good to which Machiavelli objects. It displays both theological virtues and moral virtues. And justice appears twice, once under the theological virtues, featuring capital punishment, and once under wisdom, which then leads to concord, and out of concord comes a cord, a golden cord, that connects all citizens to a single man, an individual who represents the Sienese community. Here is confusion, or let us say complication, arising from the typical problems of classical political philosophy mixed with Christianity. The relationships between intellectual and moral virtue, between theology and philosophy, between morality and political concord. In this painting, the political effects, good and bad, emerge from an articulation of the good. In Machiavelli, the effects result from an imputed necessity that deliberately ignores what people say and what thinkers think, and which is an end run, you could say, around the choice between good and evil. Our social science today believes in what it calls the fact-value distinction, meaning that fact is science and value is not. In so behaving, it ignores, as much as it can, the profession of good that accompanies every human action. And it follows Machiavelli's effectual truth unconsciously and with brusque, unjustified confidence in its own independence. So to sum up this compressed view of Machiavelli's enterprise, it is new and recommends what is new. It shows that the use of dirty tricks is for our good. It reveals the philosopher as prince. It calls for the effectual versus the imagined truth. It finds that truth in the world, which is the world of necessity and the world of sense. It uncovers and explains what later would be called fact. It solves problems by simplifying them in the manner of modern natural and social science. A difficulty remains, however, in the notion of effectual truth. Is all truth effectual truth? Is philosophy now to have an agenda for changing the world, rendering it more rational, and leaving behind the former philosophy that wished merely to understand, and not to understand for the sake of power to effect change? Machiavelli promises that the effectual truth will work. It will save us from ruin among so many who are not good. But is it true that it works? Have we not seen in the 20th century that atheist regimes can be as harmful to humanity, indeed far more harmful, than the religious ones that Machiavelli and Hobbes and all the other modern philosophers feared and despised and attempted to replace? The truth of effectual truth has to be judged according to its promises, its professions of good. This truth would be the plain truth, not effectual or tendentious truth. Thus, Machiavelli cannot affirm that all truth is effectual, and must retain the possibility of appealing to plain truth of the same sort that Plato and Aristotle appealed to without the promise of the modern agenda. To make this appeal, Machiavelli's promises have to be compared with the promises, or lack of promises, by Plato and Aristotle. Yet here the difficulty stubbornly persists. To make a judgment on the success of Machiavelli's enterprise, one must be aware of the alternative to it in the classical tradition. From Machiavelli's self-description in his famous letter of December 1513, we know that he was aware of the ancients to whom he posed questions. He lived in the age known today as the Renaissance, the rebirth. That's what it means, rebirth. And a rebirth of what? Of the classical tradition. Yet no achievement of the Renaissance was greater than Machiavelli's enterprise. The founding of a new understanding of philosophy that transformed and superseded the classical tradition. The modern philosophy Machiavelli founded, like the modern science founded by his successors, has the character of progress, each stage going further than the preceding, and if not erasing it, rendering it obsolete. Today it takes very considerable effort to recall the ancients that Machiavelli summed up in his study, according to the 1513 letter. It is no longer in fashion, even among philosophers, to ask questions of the ancients and to listen to their answers. This means that it is very difficult to judge whether Machiavelli's enterprise has in fact worked. His great power is there to be appreciated, but his enterprise is covered over by his own success, and he himself, despite his own success, seems simplistic and irrelevant to us today. We are altogether too much impressed by effectual truth. Thanks. That's fine. Good. I might take a question. Yeah. Question? Yes.
When Machiavelli left his card playing and went home and studied the ancients, what did he think was the effectual truth of that, of those 4 hours?
Well, what was the consequence of the conversations that he had? I think what he thought was that he had saved philosophy, ancient philosophy, but also that he had saved the world for non-philosophers as well. It doesn't. I say this because it doesn't seem that the world was endangered, as he knew it, was endangered for philosophy. There were all these humanists, and who were, in some sense, certainly revolting from scholasticism, and therefore from what was later called Aristotelian, and from this combination of Christian theology and Greek philosophy. So he could have been a humanist like the other humanists. What distinguished him was his open attack on Christianity. None of them did that. There was Bruno, who was burned at the stake for denying the immortality of the soul and things. There were things you could say, but he never attacked. He said the things about Christianity, which Machiavelli says in 3 places in his Discourses on Livy. So there's one of the Discourses, the last one in the second book, 233, in which he speaks of the Roman practice of allowing a free commission to their captains. And I think this is a kind of picture of how he regards himself. That when a Roman captain was out on the campaign and found a situation which his orders hadn't been prepared for, he had a free commission to act as he thought right. And so Fabius, who I think often stands in for Machiavelli in the Discourses, was the general in this case. He came to a strange forest which nobody knew the way out of. And so he found a way out of it, but to do so he had to disobey what the instructions of the Senate were. And the Senate sent some ambassadors to Fabius to reprove him for having done so. And Fabius argued to them that it was necessary. And they went back and convinced the Senate that he had done right. So Senate, I think this is Machiavelli's many personifications. Here it stands for the classical tradition, the way in which the noble Romans regarded and defended themselves, had given him as a philosopher the commission to do what was necessary for their good in the present circumstances which they had not forecast. This is something like what Marsilius speaks of, to a new unknown cause of revolution and of rebellion that Aristotle hadn't known of when he wrote about revolutions in Book 5 of the Politics. And so then that was Christianity or the claim of the Pope. So this is something similar to that, and I would say so that he thought, as qua philosopher, that this change in philosophy away from contemplation to action and to knowledge of the world was necessary to for the sake of philosophy, but also I think it would have to be for the sake of politics as well. Or that he had, you might say that would mean that he had from the beginning a kind of non-philosophical desire to improve the world. Yeah. Anyway, thanks. It's good to see you. Anyway. Yeah. Yes.
Just to be clear, are you suggesting that Plato or Aristotle or another classical philosopher would agree with Machiavelli's steps taken in Machiavelli's time?
And I'm saying that in this instance, he's putting words in their mouths. That he likes to do that. And he talks about Livy. Livy sometimes puts words in people's mouths, and then Machiavelli goes and puts words in Livy's mouth. When you put words in somebody else's mouth, you're using that other person as an authority. So you make him into the author of what you really believe. That's a form of deceit. Authors are deceivers in that way. He speaks of the authors, what the authors say, and he also speaks of the writers, scrittori. So those are phrases he uses to describe others, but something that he does too.
You mentioned a couple times, just briefly, this connection between Machiavelli's notion of effectual truth and the foundations of modern science in Bacon and Descartes. I'm just wondering if you could say more about that connection.
Yeah. Well, Bacon certainly made his obeisance to one of the doctors of Italy, he calls him, Nick Machiavelli. The world can be understood in its own terms as a world of sense. And the problems that face us can best be understood as necessities that come out of events or facts or causes that aren't from some intelligible source, but that we can understand as they move, as necessities move, the motions of things. And so you can understand, in other words, fact as something that is today it's called data, and I think that's a fact is something that is it's a given. You have to accept it. Why do you have to accept it? Because it's unintelligible in its way. You can't wish your way out of it. A fact is against what is your will or your wish. So the world is made up of facts of that kind. And this is a way of curbing the imagination. In Plato, he speaks of how you perceive things through making an image of them. And then by looking at that image, you can work out what is intelligible in the thing. So you look at a tree and you make an image of the tree, and then you see how the tree is put together, branches and so on, how it all fits as a whole. And that what you end up then is not with a perception, but with something that's invisible, namely a definition or an idea of a tree. But the idea of a tree begins from the perception. So the perception is pregnant, you could say, with its intelligible explanation. So this is why the Greeks didn't refer to fact, but fact is something which was discovered. That's a modern discovery, the world of fact. So fact is a perception that can't be otherwise. Then you can't wish it into something else that isn't there. So it's a way of combating knowledge through visions. And it's a way of combating Christianity or theological visions of God. But on the other hand, once you have fact, your imagination is also liberated. So in the Discourses and the Prince, Machiavelli refers 11 times to different kinds of imaging or imagining. And 10 out of the 11 are bad. And they're all somehow either religious or could be religious. Visions that make you fearful. And you can be your army. You have to, if you're a captain, you have to watch out for such visions that'll make your soldiers afraid. But there's one, and that's in the only chapter that's in 331. It's the only chapter in which he uses the word science or knowledge, or even firm science. And there he speaks of how Xenophon made hunting into an image of the art of war. And hunting is an image of, you look in Plato and Aristotle, it's an image of philosophy, of sort of hunting for your ideas, or even for people, students, who might be interested in what you have to say. Hunting, you captivate when you're hunting. But for him, however, and then he refers to another image. It's too long, too complicated to explain. But if you look at that chapter, you would see that that is good use of imagination, and it's an imagination which is freed, say, because it doesn't have to begin from intelligibility. So the kind of reasoning which isn't intelligible is a kind of mathematical reasoning, or reasoning, or what's called conceptualization, the concept. In other words, with Bacon and Descartes and some of these other modern philosophers, you get two kind of parallel, but I would say twin developments. So one is empiricism, stick to the facts, bud, and the other is rationalism. You can reason your way to new ideas, new concepts, and which don't have any arguable or necessary relation to the way things are, sort of like modern physics. Modern physics, is that the way things are, or is it a beautiful imagination? So that's really hard question to answer in modern science. So something of the identity of those two things. Yeah, back.
So you mentioned that the ruler, the prince of Machiavelli's lives, he's ruled people without allowing them to know they're being ruled.
Yeah. Yes.
For their own good.
Yeah.
So they don't have the truth, and they don't have freedom. Well, what is his vision for good then? What do the people have? What is the good?
Yeah, well, they have what they understand as freedom, which is freedom from him, or from. They have freedom in their own lives, their property, and their wives. So their family, and so that's security. That's later. We have a good kind of liberal life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's kind of a somewhat expanded version of that, but still, this is what Machiavelli says in The Prince. A prince should respect for the people, so they get security, so they get their freedom, what they understand by it. They're not deep thinkers. They're vulgar. He still uses that word. So he's democratized knowledge, because what is knowledge is now what appears as fact to the average person. But he still retains that distinction between the vulgar and the non-vulgar, people like himself, who sit down to the food that is mine alone. That's a pretty exclusionary statement. Yeah.
I'd like to briefly ask about the liberty of the prince. You mentioned a desire to command, a desire not to be king. When you think about his phrase, that a prince can introduce into matter any form he pleases, presumably that activity is informed in part by necessity, which we were discussing before. But my question is, do you think it's completely informed by necessity, or is a prince, one of these truly great princes, are they at liberty to introduce multiple forms as they wish, with some concession to necessity, or how does this liberty work?
They'll go wrong if they try to understand themselves as free creators. Yeah. No, you better look ahead anxiously into an unknown future. That's prudence. And consider what the other guy will do to you, and you have to do it to him before he does it to you. So you could say that the foremost lesson of Machiavellian prudence is anxious anticipation. And therefore, that perhaps the most important chapter, somebody said this, in the whole Discourses on Livy is 152, which is about that. When that's in Machiavelli suggests to his former boss, Piero Soderini, that he commit the action that he should have committed the action that was done to him before it was done to him. Yeah.
At the beginning of the Discourses, spoke that Machiavelli had a natural desire to help others. Is there like a necessity behind that, or is it a
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's right. That's good. And he doesn't. Yeah. It does seem to be natural in the sense of compelling, which is also in the sense of necessary. See, he understands nature as composed of necessities. But to do that, he has to expand the notion of necessity. Necessity in its first appearance would mean what you can't help doing, like eating and drinking, going to the bathroom. These are necessities. They can be postponed, and also they can be done in a certain way or not, with manners or without. But then he uses the phrase, and so that's one notion of necessity that actually compels you to do something. But the other is you have a choice, and you can do the non-necessary thing and make a mistake, or you can act, quote, according to necessity. So from being a compulsion, necessity gets transformed into being a guide for choice. So he's not altogether suppressing the idea that you have a choice. But if you understand things, now of course understanding things too may be difficult, since these things don't follow necessary laws. The world is variable, so different circumstances may make one policy effective, and different circumstances may not be effective. So you may or may not be, and you still need to be lucky to win. So that he's not saying that there is no fortune, no chance. So, because without chance there wouldn't be any virtue, and he wants to sustain. That's what he wants to improve, the prospects for human virtue. So that, but still, human virtue is only successful as virtue when it's in accord with necessity. It's just that you can't always predict that, which means that, say, two republics, both of them acting on Machiavelli's principles, one of them may still win over the other, and you couldn't predict that from, or two rival princes, both Machiavellian. This could make a kind of comedy, I think, to see when they try to figure each other out. But still virtue, so then virtue is still in the realm of, but this is why he stops short of Bacon and modern science. He stops short of determinism, because determinism would do away with virtue.
I mean, more like, what's the source of motivation for helping other people?
Your motivation for helping other people is that will help you.
Well, how is writing these books going to help Machiavelli?
Immortal glory. In the funny guise of immortal infamy. But he's confident that there will be a few of us who read and see that he's not as he's more interesting than appears. Much more. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple times in the lecture that how Machiavelli would personify the world.
Yes.
Is it a good use of imagination or a bad use of imagination that allows him to do that?
It's good the way he does it. In his view. That's a big topic, personification, but there's many examples of it. It runs through Machiavelli. You can't really read Machiavelli except at a very ordinary level, unless you see that's what he's doing. And that, in other words, that persons or groups or with proper names represent ideas or tendencies or even philosophies. The French, for example. Why does he refer to the Gauls, ancient French, as the French? Who are the French? Or Italy, which I mentioned. That he says in the title to the last chapter in the Prince, that exhortation to seize Italy from the barbarians. Who are the barbarians? The French king and the Spanish king. Why are they so barbarian? Yeah. Sometimes he lies. There's a letter of his in which he says that he lies so much that he hardly knows when he's telling the truth. Yeah. So if you want to know what I think the actual meaning of that last chapter in the Prince is, you have to look at what is the opposite to the barbarians. Yeah.
Can you think there's a difference or what the difference is between Machiavelli's sort of philosophical philanthropism and the role of philosophy now to be some kind of helping the world by pointing out what the ordinary desires are and somebody like Marx who says philosophy now?
Yeah, to change the world. Yeah. So he began that. I think Machiavelli did. Yeah.
Marx went wrong somewhere?
Yes. But yes, too rational, deterministic, and so, yeah. And he wanted to start a world revolution. Machiavelli still liked nations and republics, smaller units. And Machiavelli believed that glory was important, not just economic, or not just the free development of one's faculties, but the excellent development of them, together with the recognition that comes. Let me say, I should say one more thing about personification. That comes about through what Plato calls thumos, the world of man who's very spirited. He believes that he faces a kind of chaos in which he and his thought or his promises are the only solution, or to which they're the only solution. But he thinks that this solution will come if he can call upon the powers that be, the gods, or all nature, to help him, as if all of nature was focused on our little problems and difficulties. So this angry or spirited person tends to make a world of anthropocentric teleology, as that a whole nature and God have as their purpose taking care of me. And so you tend to, that means that you turn nature or sort of impersonal things into persons to whom you can appeal. So this understanding would be saying that religion is and this is, I think, how Machiavelli looks at religion. Religion is a way of that weak people call on the strength of the gods to defend them against strong people. And they make sort of the impersonal laws or necessities or even natures of things into persons to whom they can appeal or pray or worship. And this means that this personification then is what you can make them do. So Machiavelli shows in the Effectual Truth how different ways of thinking, even different philosophies, are made effectual through the people who espouse them, and the consequences that their or those philosophies will lead to. So who were the French? What was France known for in Machiavelli's time and before? Paris.
What's Paris?
Who lived in Paris? Who taught from Paris? Aquinas. Try that. Yeah. Yes.
You've spoken a great deal about the role of necessity guiding the prince in his decision-making. And you've drawn a contrast between the prince and not only the Christian, but the classical approach. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role of necessity for the prudent statesman in the Aristotelian understanding, so you could kind of clarify the difference that you have in mind.
Yeah, well, for Aristotle, the statesman should look at the regime. The regime is a kind of human whole. It represents a way of life. And that is the way in which we live out our moral lives and our political lives, wrapped together. So, you shouldn't look directly at people's natures, and especially at the nature which makes each one of us individual, but rather consider, as he says, that man is by nature a political animal. So he would begin or tell the statesman to look at regimes and whether your regime is worthy or not. And in both cases, because even a worthy one might be better, how to improve. And how to improve would be, the test for that would be the community and not your particular glory. You might get glory from, like George Washington, for having done wonderful things for your community. But but we have a reluctance to believe, Machiavelli agrees with this, that was his only motive. So maybe what we are reluctant to believe, and why we call Machiavelli Machiavellian, ought to be taken more seriously by the statesman than Machiavelli does. See, Machiavelli breaks down human beings into two types, that I was saying. The types that want to command and those that don't want to be commanded. That's too much of a breakdown. That's a reduction. Actually, there are different ways to command, and different things that you would not want to be commanded to do. And besides, it isn't altogether clear to me that anybody, that it isn't part of human nature, and this is what Aristotle is saying, to want to rule. Machiavelli is in effect saying that democracy is not possible. It's not a possible regime because it's always ruled by an elite. You hear that a lot today, and it couldn't be more wrong. Yeah. Yes.
I wonder to what extent fortune is one of those facts that you get in the lesson. It seems to me that really gets at its conceptual nature.
Yeah, you should understand the fact as what comes by fortune, and maybe according to a law in its behavior, but it has no logic. That would be what distinguishes it from a perception, as you would see in classical rationalism. Machiavelli's a kind of rationalist because he thinks that the power of prudence. Yes, you have the power to anticipate, which today is, in scientific terms, the power to predict. We explain by predicting. So that's what when he gives these rules of behavior, those are all sort of like, a lot of them are jokey with him. Safer to be feared than loved. Well, it's true, so that's his anticipation, I would say, of sort of the fundamental principle of science.
You said at the end of your talk that we're altogether too impressed with the effectual truth, so we can't even compare it with anything else.
Yeah.
So would you say that then, in order to propose to people the contemplative life, to propose beginning a hunt for the truth in the classical or Christian sense, that you have to rely on the fact that they have already experienced some doubt in the promises of effectual truth? That there's already in them some seed of that doubt that they would look elsewhere?
Yes, right. That just a common sense view of truth. That he explains to you the logic of evil. Well, your common sense experience would tell you that there are honest people. He says, yes, there are honest people. It's just that they come to grief. Or if they don't come to grief, they were lucky. In principle, they could have come to grief. Everybody has to be ready, for the one decision in his life by which he will betray his principles and his closest friends. Because you'll have to be ready for that. And if you are, then you're a Machiavellian. You don't have to practice it all the time. You just think. So in this way, he corrupts you. He kind of corrupts that doubt. Or he nourishes the doubt that there's anything good. So he really wants to make you think of to replace the sort of the presumption that the world is good and that good people generally succeed. And they don't come to grief because of their goodness. He wants to reverse that presumption.
Perhaps one last question.
Yes.
This question is born more out of hope than belief in it, but does Machiavelli think by doing this and this being essentially, carrying out his enterprise, is that going to make the world better, or is that going to make the world better for him?
Both. Yeah. There's something in it for everybody. Yeah. His play Mandragora is all about this. It's about a couple that cannot conceive and who want a child, and the possibility is presented to them of committing adultery in order to conceive, and the woman who refuses because she's pious But Machiavelli points out that the Bible, you could say, contradicts itself. On the one hand, it wants you to be fruitful and multiply. On the other hand, it opposes adultery, but it might be in a case where a couple can't conceive that adultery would be the only way in which they could have a child. And they have to get over this hang-up or this inhibition of wanting, say, a father's desire to have the child be his own. So it's about, I think, about a person who consents, a father or a husband who consents to be a cuckold, and a wife who consents to be a whore. And they get a child from it, and everybody in the conspiracy, it's really a conspiracy in the plot of the play, is rewarded. So the general lesson is, from good you get evil, but from evil you get good. That's your hope.